Deep in the forest, in the heart of the greenwood, lives a legend. A great outlaw whose stories are as old and beguiling as England itself. But the ballads of old paint a very different picture of the righteous swashbuckler in Lincoln Green that we know today. So when did the stories begin? Were they based on a real person, or just a fanciful creation from centuries of oral tradition? Only the tales can tell. This is the story of Robin Hood. The legends of Robin Hood, at least the ones written down, date back to the 1400s, with the oral mentions of Robin dating back even earlier. The truest depictions of Robin should lie in the earliest adventures attributed to him. These stories, written in ballad form, give insight into not only Robin Hood, but also the culture and time in which they were written. The earliest Robin Hood tale, at least the earliest that still survives, is the ballad Robin Hood and the Monk. This ballad dates back to about 1450, though like most legends about the outlaw, English ears likely heard the rhymes much earlier. Robin Hood and the Monk begins on a beautiful morning in the greenwood. Robin expresses his sadness that he hasn't been able to attend Mass, and despite protestations from his fellow outlaw Much, Robin decides to go to Nottingham to attend church. He refuses protection, save for the company of Little John, and the two make their way to Nottingham. On the road there, Little John and Robin squabble over a bet, and in a huff, John leaves. While at St. Mary's Church, Robin is spotted by a monk he once robbed. A fight ensues, and Robin is arrested by the sheriff. Word gets back to the outlaws, and Little John, always loyal, decides to rescue their leader with Much in tow. On their journey, the two come across the same monk who tattled on Robin. The outlaws trick the monk, kill him and his page. The outlaws take the letters from the monk meant for the king about Robin's arrest. They have an audience with the king, and the king sends them back to Nottingham to retrieve Robin. Upon their return, the sheriff receives Little John and Much, not knowing their true identities, and giddy over Robin's downfall, gets drunk. Taking advantage of the sheriff's inebriation, the outlaws and Robin escape, killing the jailer in the process. A happy ending for Robin and a sad one for the sheriff, the outlaws get away scot-free, and the king, while annoyed, lets the matter go. The jest of Robin Hood, jest here meaning something like adventure or deed, is the lengthiest of all the Robin Hood ballads, likely because it's an amalgam of different tales compiled well after their initial incarnations. This makes sense since the jest as a compilation dates to the late 1400s, but historians believe the original sources come from about a century earlier. The jest begins with Robin and his gang in the forest. Robin has heard 3 masses and has spent a long time fasting. Little John suggests he eat something, but Robin will not hear of dining until a guest is found to pay for the feast. Little John, along with Much the miller's son and Will Scarlock, find a guest and bring him to dinner. When Robin asks for payment, the guest, an impoverished knight, says he cannot pay. The knight says he's indebted to an abbot of St. Mary's Abbey to the tune of £400. The debt is now due, but as the knight has no money, he will lose his lands. Robin takes pity on the poor knight and loans him the £400. This section of the story ends with the knight repaying the surprised and greedy abbot. The tale then veers into another direction involving an archery competition, and Little John becoming employed by an unknowing sheriff of Nottingham. There's a fight between Little John and the sheriff's cook, ending with the cook joining Robin Hood's gang. Little John, still unknown to the sheriff, tricks the sheriff into following him into the forest. Robin and his gang ambush the sheriff and his men. After a night in the forest, the sheriff begs for his release, and Robin concedes. The jest then returns to the knight's tale, with a year having passed and his debt to Robin due. Robin is worried that the knight is running late, and asks for another guest for dinner. This time, the outlaws happen upon and surround an abbot, the very same abbot the knight was indebted to. The abbot, unlike the knight, lies about the money on his person, and because of his dishonesty, Robin robs the abbot of 800 pounds. The abbot is released, and soon after, the knight arrives with his payment plus some interest. Robin, cheery at his good fortune, tells the knight to keep the money, and gives the knight an additional 400 pounds from the money stolen from the abbot. The next stanzas are at a later date, and have Robin and his men being attacked by the Sheriff of Nottingham, and the outlaws having to hole up in the knight's castle. The sheriff informs the king. Robin and his men return to the forest, and the sheriff captures the good knight. Robin, angry, finds the sheriff, knocks him off his horse, and beheads him. The knight is freed. The king arrives from London, and in disguise, searches for Robin in the greenwood. He happens upon Robin and his gang, and still disguised, dines with the outlaws. The king is impressed by the outlaws, and after revealing his identity, invites Robin to join his royal court. The last part of the ballad shows Robin homesick for his old lifestyle in the forest and leaving the king's service. Robin lives another 2 decades in the greenwood and meets an abrupt end when he's murdered by his cousin in an act of betrayal. Robin Hood and the Potter was found in a manuscript from around 1500 and is a much lighter tale compared to the last 2 ballads. The story opens in the forest to Robin and Little John spotting a potter approaching. Little John tells Robin the potter is quite the fighter, and he bets Robin that he can't get the potter to fork over money to cross a bridge. Robin accepts, and upon demanding payment from the potter, a duel ensues. The potter wins, and Robin is impressed. The two exchange clothes, and Robin sells pots in Nottingham. The sheriff's wife takes notice of this potter and asks him to dine. At dinner, an archery competition occurs, and of course, Robin wins. Robin tells the sheriff he knows Robin Hood and will take him to him. This, of course, is a trap, and upon entering the greenwood, the sheriff is robbed. However, Robin releases his captive out of respect for the sheriff's wife. The story ends with Robin paying the potter handsomely. The next ballad introduces one of Robin Hood's most famous foes, Guy of Gisborne. The earliest manuscript of the ballad is part of a larger collection known as the Percy Folio, a compilation of texts written in the 17th century belonging to Bishop Thomas Percy. The story of Robin's encounter with Guy of Gisborne dates back to 1475 at the latest. The story begins once again on a merry day in the forest. Robin recalls a bad dream he had, one in which he was attacked by 2 men. Little John tells him not to worry, but Robin is undeterred. The outlaws set out to find these men when they happen upon a man dressed completely in horsehide. Robin and Little John have a tiff, and John leaves. When John returns to the forest, he sees that 2 of his fellow outlaws have been slain, and Will Scarlet is being pursued by the sheriff's men. When Little John's weapon fails him, he is captured and tied to a tree. Back with Robin and the strange horseman, we learn the stranger is named Guy of Gisborne, and he is a bounty hunter looking for Robin Hood. Robin keeps his true identity to himself and suggests they try their hand at some archery. Gisborne is amazed at Robin's skills and asks for his name. Robin reveals that he is indeed Robin Hood, and the two fight. Robin kills Gisborne and cuts off his head. The mutilation goes even further when Robin uses a knife to disfigure Gisborne's face and places the head on the end of his bow. Robin wears Gisborne's clothes and comes upon the sheriff and his men. The sheriff mistakes Robin for Gisborne, and Robin is able to set Little John free. The sheriff flees, but is shot and killed by Little John. The final 2 ballads also belong to the Percy Folio. Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar is a short tale often used in May Day plays. Will Scadlock tells of a Curtal Friar who is incredibly skilled at combat, and of course, Robin must meet him. There's an odd little sequence of Robin and the friar carrying each other across the river, which ends when the friar throws Robin in the water. Robin and the friar duel and have an archery contest. Robin calls for his gang, and the friar calls for his dogs. The fight is at an impasse. The story ends with Robin asking the friar to join his outlaw band. The death of Robin Hood is also short, but expands upon the tale at the end of the jest where Robin meets his end. Robin, for whatever reason, wants to be bled, as in the ancient practice of bloodletting. It's unclear whether or not Robin is ill, and he has a cousin who can do it for him. Robin, although warned otherwise, takes only Little John and heads to Kirklees Priory. There he pays his cousin, the prioress, a large sum to do bloodletting. The prioress treacherously lets too much blood, leaving Robin frail. There's a gap in the manuscript which leaves no explanation as to why the prioress intends to harm Robin. It is also in this missing part that Red Roger, the prioress's lover, is introduced, who aids in killing Robin. Robin realizes the betrayal, manages to kill Red Roger, and weakly calls for Little John. Little John, vengeful, is ready to burn Kirklees to the ground. Robin rejects this and asks for his bow so he may shoot an arrow out of the window to mark his burial place. Now, even the quickest glance at the ballads show us a Robin Hood that is quite foreign to the contemporary interpretations of the story that we know today. Not only do the original adventures provide entertainment value, they also give insight into England's medieval world and the people who inhabited it. Robin Hood is a man of the greenwood, a king of the forest. But the modern notion of forest, a lush, dense, almost enchanted woodland, isn't exactly an accurate portrayal of what the English in medieval times considered a forest. The term forest was a legal one, an idea brought over by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, where vast amounts of common land were taken by the crown and turned into royal forests. These royal forests, also known as the King's Wood, were untouchable pieces of land, only to be used by the monarch and aristocracy of his choosing. Forest law was incredibly stringent. Above all, the law protected the venison, as in animals, and vert, as in greenery, that belonged to the king. At one point, 1/4 of English lands was made up of royal forests, and this caused great hardship on the king's subjects. Commoners were not allowed to hunt the king's deer or wild boar, and the felling of trees was against the law as well. Punishment was severe for those who did not obey forest law, the consequences ranging widely from fines to execution. Robin Hood's most famous stomping grounds, Sherwood Forest, was one of the woodlands under royal jurisdiction. Once upon a time, before the sad reality that is deforestation, Sherwood Forest covered a massive 100,000 acres. To put into perspective, it was about the same size as what Denver, Colorado is today. Unfortunately, Sherwood Forest is now but a shell of its former self, covering less than 1,000 acres. But even in the times of Robin Hood, the forest was not a dense, lush curtain of never-ending trees, but was made up of both woodlands and open clearings. Many commoners actually lived and farmed within the forest boundary. The Great North Road, which was the main route leading from York to London, actually ran right through Sherwood, perfect for travelers, and an equally perfect place for outlaws and thieves to rob those passing through. The ballads show, however, that Sherwood Forest was not always the definitive home for England's most famous outlaw. 50-odd miles from Nottinghamshire was a spot of land in South Yorkshire, formerly West Riding, called Barnsdale. Lightly wooded and with no actual fixed boundaries, Barnsdale was not considered a royal forest. However, in two of the oldest ballads, The Jest of Robin Hood and Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, Robin is firmly placed in Barnsdale, not Sherwood Forest. Other sources, though, such as Robin Hood and the Monk, and a Lincoln Cathedral manuscript from 1410 declare Robin living in Sherwood. To add to this geographical confusion, the Sheriff of Nottingham is across the board Robin's main rival, even in the story set in Barnsdale, which is well out of the Sheriff's Nottinghamshire jurisdiction. So which is it, Barnsdale or Sherwood? Well, no one knows. What is usually agreed upon by historians, though, is that as centuries went on, and as the Robin Hood tales grew and evolved, the stories were probably mixed and matched, and tailored to fit whatever audience was listening to the stories at that time. What is interesting to note is that the village of Locksley is completely absent in the original ballads. In many of the modern books and films, Locksley is Robin's home, sometimes his own estate, before his exile into outlawry. This leads to another fascinating discrepancy. The Robin Hood of the ballads is not an ousted lord or a member of the aristocracy. He's a yeoman. English society in medieval times operated under and within the feudal system. The structure of feudalism, controlled by those with money and lands, held the most power, and those with less, which were the majority of England's inhabitants, were dependent upon the ruling class. Ergo, the nobles held the lands, and the peasants would live on those lands in exchange for services and labor. At the top, of course, was the king, followed by nobles or members of the aristocracy. Below the aristocracy were knights, and at the bottom, making up 90% of the population, were peasants, made up of freedmen and serfs, legally tied to their lord's land. As the years went on, some changes occurred to the feudal social structure, and the yeoman class emerged. The yeomen, ranking lower than a knight but higher than serfs, were independent and could own their own land, as opposed to serfs who were tenant farmers. Robin Hood, in all the original ballads, was a yeoman. Unlike later iterations, Robin was not a lord, but rather a middle-class hero. It wasn't until the 16th century that playwright Anthony Munday gentrified Robin and accredited the outlaw an origin story and an earldom in his two plays, The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. The works had huge influence on the evolution of the Robin Hood story. Robin's lower-class leanings were lost, and the lord-turned-outlaw trope became the standard. An outlaw was the placement of a person outside of the law, meaning if a man was declared an outlaw, he lost the right of protection that English law and society afforded. This meant an outlaw could be captured and killed at will. The person's goods and lands, if he had any, would be seized by the crown. Outlawry was an alternative to the death penalty for crimes such as treason, rebellion, serious felonies, or defaulting on debt, though most cases of debt-related issues did not reach outlawry. Additionally, a person had to be over the age of 14 to be outlawed, and while women couldn't technically be outlawed, the female equivalent of waiving had the same effects. The life of an outlaw was a hard one. The real Robin, if there was one, would have been a product of a dark and dangerous environment, a world with harsh rules and even harsher consequences. Between the harsh penalties afforded by the law, the tough realities of basic survival, and the proclivity for violence in medieval society, it's no wonder the original ballads feel more akin to Grimm's tales rather than Disney. Robin's symbol, in fact, the thing with which he is most associated with, is a weapon. The longbow was commonplace in the time of the original ballads and was associated with the yeoman class. In 1252, a law was passed which made it obligatory for all Englishmen aged 15 to 60 to equip themselves with bows and arrows. Years later, in 1363, another law was passed which required archers to practice archery every Sunday. So, after church services, men of age and able body would make their way to the training grounds located in the outskirts of the village and would practice shooting at turf-covered mounds called butts. The best longbows used for archery were called yew bows. Handcrafted, of course, the bows were ideally made from the wood of the yew tree. Wood from the yew was perfect for bow making, as it is a strong but elastic wood, giving the bow a greater, more powerful draw. Traditional English longbows, called self-bows, is a bow design made from a single piece of wood. Archers would have had to have a great deal of strength to operate this seemingly simple weapon, and our outlaw heroes were more than willing to use their weapons. In Robin Hood and the Monk, Little John and Much, without a second thought, kill a man of the cloth out of revenge, and a young page boy just because he was a witness. Robin, too, is not a hero innocent either. He kills Guy of Gisborne, admittedly in self-defense, but then savagely violates Guy's body. Medieval audiences' adulation for heroes with such proclivity to violence makes for an interesting dichotomy. The world in which Robin Hood was born was a brutal one, but also a deeply religious one. Also, many of the villains in the stories are actually religious leaders, such as monks who are shown as being greedy and corrupt. The sheriff, too, is representative of an unjust law enforcement. It would seem only the king escapes the stories with his reputation unscathed, Robin and the outlaws always remaining loyal to their sovereign lord. On the subject of the king, which monarch ruled during the time of a real Robin Hood serves as a benchmark as to when the stories take place. In theory, this should make it easy to place the original Robin Hood tales as the years of each ruling English monarch were well defined and documented. Still, historians cannot determine which king to attribute the Robin Hood tales to. Later versions of Robin Hood's adventures, like Anthony Munday's plays, place Robin Hood in the time of King Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart. King Richard I reigned for 10 years, lasting from 1189 to 1199. However, when a king is mentioned in the early ballads, he is referred to as either the king, or as in the Jest of Robin Hood, as Edward. This would seem to narrow our royal suspects down a bit, right? Not exactly. In the time frame that the Robin Hood stories were created, 6 King Edwards had sat on the English throne. 3 Edwards had been king before the Norman conquest in 1066, and 3 more kings named Edward in the post-Norman conquest by the time the Robin Hood stories cropped up. As to which of the King Edwards made a cameo in the Jest of Robin Hood, the jury is still out. In the Jest, the king makes a visit to Nottingham. Some Robin Hood historians have tried to use this as evidence to decide which king fits the part. Edward II, who reigned from 1307 to 1327, looks promising on the surface. The king made a progress in the north which included Nottingham in 1323. Tantalizingly, there was a Robin or Robert Hood reported as being in the king's service in 1324. However, there's no evidence that this particular Mr. Hood was ever an outlaw. Also, in court rolls of the times, there were many men called variations of Robin Hood, dating decades earlier than this particular Robin, but we'll go into that later. Also, the Edward in the Jest is referred to as our comely King Edward. Edward II, while comely in physical appearance, was not particularly liked. The comely characteristic is better fitting to Edward II's son, Edward III/Edward the Confessor, who reigned for a staggering 50 years from 1327 to 1377, and had an excellent reputation during his tenure as monarch. Edward III is the popular choice for various reasons for the king in the ballads, but again, it's up for debate. The name Edward may as well be a red herring, and the name was used generically or the name changed as the teller of the tales tailored the stories to fit the time and place of their audiences. But the king is actually one of the least important people in our cast of characters. The character most recurring, besides Robin and the sheriff, is Little John, Robin's right-hand man. Little John is an important member of the outlaw gang, a superb fighter, and is often more sensible than Robin himself. Much the Miller's son is repeatedly mentioned, as well as his fellow outlaw, Will, who has a myriad of surnames. Sometimes he's Will Scarlet, presumably because of the color clothes he wears, and sometimes it's variants of Scarlock, Scadlock, and Scathellock. Something as compelling as those who are mentioned within the original Robin Hood ballads are those that are not mentioned. The name Friar Tuck becomes associated with Robin years after the original ballads as a character in the May Day festivals. The festivals of the celebration of summer, the May Games, and the Robin Hood legends are often synonymous with each other. However, many believe Friar Tuck and the friar from Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar to be one and the same. Even Robin's main love interest, Maid Marian, is nowhere to be found in the original tales. Women, in fact, are a scarcity in the original ballads, and is a later addition which, like Friar Tuck, is attributed to the May Games. As can be seen, the original ballads depict a very different Robin from more modern interpretations. Medieval Robin was an extremely flawed character, a sore loser with a stubborn streak, and open to violence. He is an excellent archer, but is often bested in hand-to-hand combat. There is no mention in the stories of unjust taxation, only corrupt institutions exemplified by greedy monks and a sheriff with a chip on his shoulder. Robin and his men don't steal from the rich and give to the poor. One of the few times Robin shows any semblance of charity is with the down-on-his-luck knight, and even then, only after preparing to rob him does Robin offer a loan. Robin fully expects repayment. Something else that has been lost to time is Robin's utter devotion to the Virgin Mary. He fasts for her to the point of starvation, he prays to her, and believes all his success and happiness is due to her. Mother Mary is Robin's leading lady in a world where a female counterpart, i.e., Maid Marian, is non-existent. This fact is all the more fascinating due to the fact that Robin is a walking contradiction. He is deeply religious, but freely sins. He murders, gambles, and robs without hesitation. This makes for an interesting moral code. The audience who originally created and listened to the earliest ballads created and admired a hero who often failed and was often morally reprehensible. Now for the question everyone wants the answer to. Was Robin Hood a real person? Historians have been trying to answer this question for, the last few hundred years or so, and like most things in history, no one knows for sure. Some historians state categorically that no, a real Robin Hood never existed, while more optimistic historians have scoured the annals of history and have come up with some interesting candidates. But first, let's look at the earliest written mention of Robin Hood and work back from there. The Vision of Piers Plowman, written by William Langland, is, according to the University of Oxford, an English allegorical poem dating back to 1380, though some sources date it to specifically 1377. The poem follows the dreams of the main character of the tale, Will, on his search for how to lead a good Christian life. Along the way, Will encounters personified versions of medieval Christianity's vices and virtues, which includes one of the 7 deadly sins, sloth. Sloth, who represents laziness, carelessness, or apathy, declares, "I do not know the Lord's Prayer as the priest sings it, but I do know rhymes of Robin Hood." There are multiple versions and copies of the Piers Plowman manuscript, and William Langland was not a native to Nottingham or Yorkshire. One can deduce from this that by 1380, Robin Hood was not just a local hero, but a widespread and popular character. While this is the first written mention of the Robin Hood legends, the actual Robin Hood name goes back even further. In 1852, antiquarian Joseph Hunter published a pamphlet which described his Robin Hood-related findings. Hunter had found in the archives that a Robin or Robert Hood was a porter in the service of King Edward II in the 1320s. Edward II had gone on progress to Nottingham, just as described in Robin Hood's Jest. Hunter went a step further, saying that there was a Robin Hood and his wife Matilda, a name awfully close to Marian, in the court rolls of Wakefield in 1316 and 1317. From this, Hunter believed that this Robert Hood was outlawed, only to join King Edward's service while the king was on progress, as the Jest suggests. Other than this convenient timeline, though, Hunter did not provide any evidence to link Robin Hood, the king's porter, to the Robin Hood of Wakefield. Also, there's no evidence that the Robin Hood in the king's service was ever involved in outlaw behavior. While it is tempting to believe that Joseph Hunter's find is the real Robin, there are others that can be found that date back much earlier. Additionally, there are instances where the surname Robin Hood or Robin Hood appear in historical records. Now, the last name Hood is not particularly unusual at this time, but Robin Hood, as a surname, is quite peculiar. One of the earliest examples of a person by this name is a man from Sussex named Gilbert Robin Hood. The man is recorded in a tax roll from 1296. Similarly, during this time, it seems the moniker Robin Hood became synonymous with outlawry and general criminal behavior. Robin Hoods and Robahods are found littered throughout court records in the latter half of the 13th century. One ne'er-do-well in particular is a fellow discovered by Dr. David Crooks by the name of William Robahod. Robahod appears in record from 1261 to 1262 for theft and harboring fugitives. Robahod was the son of one Robert Lefevre from Berkshire and became a fugitive, having fled authorities. It does seem that Robin Hood became a nickname associated with illicit behavior. This gives credence to the more skeptical of historians who believe Robin Hood to be a creation culminated through years of storytelling. But there is one final contender for the real Robin, which is rather enticing. In 1936, L.V.D. Owens discovered, deep within the records, a fugitive by the name of Robert Hood. The outlaw, nicknamed Hobbyhod, dates back to 1225, a century and a half before Piers Plowman and over 200 years before Robin Hood and the Monk. Little is known of this outlaw other than he was indeed a robber, and his criminality is recorded in records from, drumroll, Yorkshire. So, what's to be said about Robin Hood? Well, unlike later interpretations of an infallible hero, a champion of the underprivileged who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, the original Robin was surprisingly human, at least figuratively speaking. The early Robin was a strange dichotomy, a devout Catholic who despised the clergy, a man who loved his king but hated authority, an excellent archer but not the best fighter, a character who is petulant, impulsive, and arrogant, but loyal and dearly beloved by his men as their leader. The world in which Robin was born was a hard one, especially for those unfortunate enough to be born without titles or wealth. Surviving under such an oppressive society was tough, so it's no wonder audiences of the time looked to a rebel who thumbed his nose at power and corruption. In Robin, they found something just in an unjust world. And whether a real Robin Hood actually existed, well, the jury's still out on this one. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Robin Hood was, and is, whatever he needs to be, a legend perfectly tailored to the times, and a hero worthy of the people. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. I also have an Instagram you can follow, and make sure to check out my Patreon for more exclusive content. See you soon!